Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another video and today's topic is, what if the end already came? This video is the next installment in my On Time Online book club. It's for On Time Re-examining the End Times and Jesus' Return, second edition. And we're going to be covering chapter 20 today, which is entitled A Dramatic End. But before I actually get into what is in this chapter, I wanted to talk about some current events that I'm sure people will bring up in the comment section. Namely, a digital ID that apparently is going to be required in the UK. I have had people asking me about that and if I thought that it could be the mark of the beast. And I think most of you know that I believe that the mark of the beast happened in the 1st century. And for those of you who are letting this worry you, letting this scare you, I know a lot of people are scared. Please take a moment to think back even to recent times. There is always something happening that people think may be the mark of the beast. Back when COVID was happening, with some people thought the jab was the mark of the beast. Some people thought the vaccine passports were the mark of the beast. There are others who back when the Social Security numbers started being handed out, and they were required in order for you to work. And, obviously then you need to have a Social Security number if you're going to earn money to buy things. So they thought the Social Security card was the mark of the beast. And, in my opinion, this digital ID is just another one of those things that people are latching onto and thinking that it has to do with end times prophecy. And, a lot of people were against Social Security cards and did not want them. A lot of people were against vaccine passports and did not get them. I did not ever get one. I did not ever get one of the jabs, And so I haven't really been following with this digital ID in the UK. But what I want to remind you is that the mark of the beast was not only about a physical mark, but it was about who the allegiance was placed in, or who people were putting their faith in. So, when it comes to like the UK requiring a digital ID for whatever it is that they want it for, I don't think that they're asking people in the UK to worship them. Now, with that being said, as we talk about the mark of the beast, and actually we're not talking about that in today's chapter because we already talked about that in one of the other chapters. So if you wanted to go through, I think there's one actually called the mark of the beast for this book. I don't remember how many videos ago it was, but anyway, the mark of the beast was written about in the book of Revelation. And what is the book of Revelation? Who was it written to? Now, many of you might be saying it was written to us. Well, no, it was not written to us. Yes, we can learn a lot from it and we can glean a lot from it for edification and for, understanding who God is and what he did for us. But the book of Revelation was written to 7 historical churches in Asia Minor. That is who the book of Revelation was written to. And it was written to historical churches that were there in John's time. John is the one who wrote the book of Revelation, through Jesus. And I should say Jesus wrote the book of Revelation through John. But it was written to people who were actually living during John's lifespan. And in fact, when it goes specifically to the letters of the churches in Revelation 2 and 3, it was saying that, things were going to happen to them soon and they were going to be granted relief soon. And this is why it's so important to understand the audience relevance of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was, we could consider it a warning to the people in that time period to let them know what was coming soon for them. And guess what? The mark of the beast was one of those things. So when we see, social media is great at fearmongering, and even the mainstream media, that's why I don't even really watch the news anymore. And I've stopped watching a lot of YouTube channels, the ones that seem to be trying to drum up fear all the time, because God does not give us a spirit of fear. He gives us a spirit of power, right? So all of this talk about the mark of the beast, and it's this, or this, it is not any of those things. The mark of the beast happened in the 1st century. Now, are there nefarious people who might try to do something similar to it to make it look like prophecy is being fulfilled as yet another means of control? Yes, I certainly would not put that out of anyone's, out of anyone's hands. I think that there are evil people who would want to do something like that. That does not make it prophetic, though. That does not, if someone is causing a self-fulfilling prophecy, that doesn't mean that it's the one that was being talked about in the book of Revelation. That one was fulfilled. So there might be copycats now, just like with serial killers and things like that. There's copycats who try to do whatever the other person did. There are people who like to control others. And they like to scare people, and they know that fear is a great way to get people to do what you want. And this is one of those things. So I'm just asking you now, don't fall for it. Don't let it worry you. And there might be a lot of things in the future that governments want us to do. And, we may fight back against them, like what happened with those vaccine passports. But that it doesn't mean that it's what was written about in the book of Revelation. That happened in the 1st century. And with all that being said, now I'm actually going to get into this chapter. So again, the chapter is called A Dramatic End. And, I entitled this video, What If the End Already Happened? The end of what? Why, the end of the world, right? Everyone thinks that the book of Revelation is about the end of the world. And it's because of the translations that are used. And sometimes it is the word world that is used in the Greek. But if you look at it in context, you will understand that the book of Revelation is about a covenant judgment on Jerusalem. It's specifically a covenant lawsuit against Israel, but this is about the judgment of Jerusalem. Old covenant Jerusalem, not the Jerusalem today, okay? The Jerusalem of today, in my opinion, not related to the biblical Jerusalem at all. And neither are the inhabitants, honestly. I believe that the Jewish people of the Old Covenant, all of their records were destroyed in the temple. So the people of today, they have no means of verifying who they actually are, what lines they come from. And the Old Covenant Jews were meticulous about their genealogies. But when that temple was destroyed, they lost those. So, and this was 2,000 years ago. So, I don't even remember where I was going with that. But the book of Revelation is about the Old Covenant world. So if you're going to say the world, it's about the world ending. Well, in a sense, yes, it was about the Old Covenant world ending. It was not about the material world, where everyone lives, whether you think it's a realm, whether you think it's a planet, whatever you think it is. It was not about everything, everywhere. This was specifically about the Old Covenant world. Now, does the resurrection have, implications universally? Yes, absolutely. But when it is talking about these specific judgments, these specific signs that we're going to be talking about today, it was referring to Old Covenant Israel, not to the entire world. This is why even when we went over Revelation 1:7, the verse where, paraphrasing, it says that every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And everyone thinks that means, one day everyone on the earth is going to see Jesus when he returns, because every eye is going to see him. And a pastor recently even brought up, well, maybe it will be an app. Maybe there will be, like, it was joking, but like maybe there will be app alerts and people will be able to look at their phone and see that this is happening, and that's how everyone's going to see him. And I think people forget that it says even those who pierced him. And I went over this in another video. Revelation 1:7 is actually referencing Zechariah 12:10, which said that they would look on them who they pierced, or they would look on him who they pierced. Who would look on them whom they pierced? Well, in Zechariah 12, it tells us that this was referring to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And it specifically says those of the house of David. Okay? Context is key. We can take a lot of verses out of the book of Revelation and make them sound, really scary or really sensationalistic. But if you actually study them in their context, you will see it just all comes together, and you will understand that this was always about Old Covenant Israel. Okay? So in the book of Revelation, it talks about many signs that would be happening in the heavens and the earth. And, the prophecies of Revelation, it includes, very dramatic, as for the title of this, chapter, a dramatic end, it includes very dramatic language of that are used in prophecies. It is apocalyptic language. So, there are many prophecies about all the stars falling to the earth, and, the sun darkening, and, the mountains shaking and moving. And this is all very similar language, if not sometimes identical language, to language used in the Old Testament that was referring to judgments of other nations. That clearly the world did not end when those judgments happened, even though it was the same type of language. And yeah, it's the same type of language. It's a literary device that is used in prophecies. And so I'll just start out with some examples, and I'm going to share with you the author of this book, John Paul's interpretations of what this might be referring to. So on page 187, it says, John foretold that God's wrath would be unleashed on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom would be plunged into moral darkness and suffering. Revelation 16 verses 10 to 11 says, the fifth poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was darkened. They gnawed their tongues because of the pain, and they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores. They still didn't repent of their works. Now, in John Paul's opinion, if you remember, the beast that it is referring to is actually the sea beast. And John Paul believes that the sea beast is actually referring to Rome, specifically the seven Caesars, like this is Caesarian, is that how you say it? Dynasty, but the seven Caesars. And what he says on page 188 is that Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD caused actual darkness to fall over the Roman Empire. And we need to remember that, Jerusalem was part of the Roman Empire at this point in time. And it says here that Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote, indeed, the amount of dust taken all together was so great that some of it reached Africa and Syria and Egypt, and it also reached Rome, filling the air overhead and darkening the sun. There, too, no little fear was occasioned that lasted for several days, since the people did not know and could not believe what had happened, but like those close at hand, believed that the whole world was being turned upside down, that the sun was disappearing into the earth, and that the earth was being lifted to the sky. These ashes now did the Romans no great harm at the time, though later they brought a terrible pestilence upon them. Now, additionally, in the other videos that I talked about with this, John Paul also believes that the Jewish zealots were the 10 horns, specifically 10 generals, but that the Jewish zealots also played a part in this. And then there are other people who have differing opinions on who the beasts were. They believe that the zealots themselves were the sea beast. But regardless, it says here that the Jewish zealots also endured dark times before and during the siege of Jerusalem. And they split into 3 factions, and they destroyed each other's food supplies. And, a lot of people don't know that. We talk about the war, the Jewish-Roman War, and we talk about the siege of Jerusalem and it lasting 3.5 years, which is all true. But by the time that the Romans actually got into the city, the factions of the Jews, they had pretty much already destroyed Jerusalem themselves. Not only destroyed it, they were killing each other. They had created a famine because of destroying the food supplies. There were pestilences happening because of people dying from the famine. They were just dropping in the streets, and all of these, germs were being spread everywhere. People were breathing this in. So the Jews themselves had far more to do with the destruction of Jerusalem than many people, I don't want to say give them credit for, but, than most people realize. Many people think that it was the Romans that came in and blazed through and just destroyed everything. And no, there really wasn't much left by the time that the Romans even got there. But anyway, it says here that the historian Josephus described a pestilential destruction caused by the unburied dead filling the city. And he wrote, "And indeed, the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another was a horrible sight, and produced a pestilential stench, which was a hindrance to those that would make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. For they were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at the very first occasioned so great a straitness upon them, that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly." So it's bad enough that all of these things were happening in Jerusalem, but this was happening during the Passover when there were millions of people. And, I'm just estimating here that were in the city specifically for the Passover. They actually got shut inside of Jerusalem while all of this was happening. Okay, so it wasn't just the normal inhabitants. It was people who were, making their trips there for the Passover. So it was really, if you look at an ideal time for the judgment of Old Covenant Israel in Jerusalem, it would be during the time when there were, even millions more people there, people of Israel who were actually in the city for Passover. So some more signs in the heavens and earth. And John Paul, he shares a lot of examples of this, and I'm not going to go over all of them today, but I'm going to share some with you. Acts 2:19-20. "I will show wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth beneath, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord comes." In Luke 21, verses 25-26, it says, "There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among the nations, bewildered by the roaring of the sea and the surging of the waves. Men will faint from fear and anxiety over what is coming upon the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken." So then John Paul says on page 190, in fulfillment of Jesus's and Joel's words, several cosmic events did occur in the skies before the Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. Cassius Dio wrote about an event in 69 AD. He said, "Evil omens occurred. A comet was seen, and the moon, contrary to precedent, appeared to suffer 2 eclipses, being obscured on the 4th and on the 7th day. Also, people saw 2 suns at once, one in the west, weak and pale, and one in the east, brilliant and powerful." Sefer Yosipon also described some events that happened during Passover in 66 AD. "Now it happened after this, that there was seen from above over the Holy of Holies for the whole night the outline of a man's face, the like of whose beauty had never been seen in all the land, and his appearance was quite awesome." So A while back I read somewhere, and I think I actually made a video about it, where people were wondering, this face that was seen in the sky, is that what the people were hiding from when they were begging, for the mountains to please fall on them? Were they hiding from, this face that was in the sky, over the Holy of Holies too, of all places? So another sign that is referred to is the 4 angels at the Euphrates, and that's something else that you hear a lot nowadays. The Euphrates is drying up, the angels are going to burst free, and they're going to come out. And the Euphrates does go through periods because, the climate changes, weather changes, so the Euphrates does dry up every now and then. And it does. So it being mentioned in the book of Revelation doesn't mean that the Euphrates was only ever going to dry up one time and then would never dry up again. It just was referring to this time when the Euphrates dried up. But it doesn't mean that every time nowadays that the Euphrates dries up just because of the weather, that it must be something biblical. Okay. So on page 193, it says Revelation describes 4 angels bound at the Euphrates who would be released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Revelation 9:14-15 says, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, free the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. The 4 angels were freed who had been prepared for that hour and day and month and year, so that they might kill 1/3 of mankind. Now, something that's very interesting is that the word angels is actually the Greek word angeloi. I probably am not saying that right, but that's how I'm saying it. And it actually, it means messengers or God's delegates. And it sometimes refers to human beings and not supernatural beings. And, some places that you could look that up are like Matthew 11:10, 2 Chronicles 36:15 and 16. John Paul has a whole list of passages here that do, I should have pulled them up, but I don't even have my Bible next to me right now. I'm so unprepared for this video today. But many, many examples of angels actually being humans, because it just means messengers, or as John Paul said, God's delegates. So one example is that John the Baptist is called an angelon, and that means a delegate of God. He was fulfilling God's purposes. And so it says, in this context, the 4 angels or delegates likely represent the 4 generals of the Roman legions stationed at the Euphrates before the Jewish war. So, yeah, there were 4 generals that were stationed there. And so according to Daniel Moraeus, he said, during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, there were 4 Roman legions under Titus's command. I'm going to butcher these names. I'm just letting you know right now, but I'll try. Legio V these are numbers. Okay. Legio the 5 Macedonia, Legio X Fretensis, that would be 10. I'm just going to say the letters. Legio XII Fulminata, and Legio XV Apollinaris. The 4 angels bound at the Euphrates appears to refer to the generals of these 4 legions. The fact that these 4 legions are said to be bound at the Euphrates also appears to be a historical Easter egg, as Titus's 4 legions were all bound at the Euphrates just 3 years before the outbreak of the Jewish revolt. In AD 63, at the conclusion of the Roman-Parthian War, all 4 of Titus's Roman legions were stationed at the Euphrates. In AD 63, the 12 Fulminata was stationed in Zeugma at the banks of the Euphrates. Exfratensis was left to guard Cappadocia, again presumably to guard the Parthian border at the Euphrates. And that year, 5 Macedonica, I think I said Macedonia before, it's Macedonica, and 15 Apollinaris crossed the Euphrates into Armenia in response to the Parthian threat. Now, what's interesting is that if we go back to this passage in Revelation 9, was it Revelation 9? Yes. Okay, so in verse 15, it says, that the 4 angels were freed who had been prepared for that hour and day and month and year, so that they might kill 1/3 of mankind. And what's interesting is that 1/3 of mankind was killed during the Jewish war. And again, that's because you need to remember, when it is speaking of mankind, this is talking about the inhabitants of Israel, or the inhabitants of Jerusalem. But this was mainly on Old Covenant Israel, by way of Jerusalem, because that was the city for Israel. All right. It says that after multitudes of Jews came from all the nations into Jerusalem for Passover, the Romans locked them inside and began their siege, like I was talking about earlier. Josephus says a significant number of people, not fewer in number than 3 million, visited Jerusalem during Passover at the start of the war. If the same number attended the feast in 70 AD, a likely scenario, those killed in Jerusalem, 1,100,000 or more than 1 million, would be 1/3 of its population. And Josephus wrote, "Now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000. So 1,100,000 is 1.1 million. And if we're going by the other numbers of it being no less than 3 million, well, 1 million is 1/3 of 3 million. Then Josephus said, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation with the citizens of Jerusalem, but not belonging to the city itself. So it was not just, people who lived in Jerusalem. It was also people visiting Jerusalem who perished in this time period. For they were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at the very first occasioned so great a straitness among them, that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterward such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly." Next, we're going to learn about the sign or the event of the 100-pound hailstones. Revelation 16:21. "And a great hail, about a talent weight, comes down out of heaven upon the men. And the men blasphemed God on account of the plague of the hail, for the plague of it is exceedingly severe." So before the temple was destroyed, this prophecy was actually fulfilled. The Romans, they hurled these white stones that they sometimes mixed with fire, and they weighed a talent, just as it said in Revelation 16:21. And in that way, unbelieving Jerusalem, symbolized as the prostitute and adulteress in Revelation, was stoned for her spiritual adultery against God, as foretold in Deuteronomy 22-24. So yeah, you're probably thinking, what do you mean, Jerusalem, the prostitute and adulteress? If you haven't been following along, yes, Jerusalem is who was being referred to as Babylon the harlot, or the harlot of Babylon. That was Old Covenant Jerusalem. Despite all the claims that people like to make nowadays, saying, oh, Babylon of Revelation is the United States, it's the UN, it's the Vatican, it's the European Union, it's the capitalistic system. Like, there's so many ideas about who the Babylon the harlot is, but it actually specifically tells you in Revelation how to understand who it is. It tells you the city where our Lord was slain. So there's only one city that Jesus was slain in, and that was in Old Covenant Jerusalem. So there are other statements in Revelation that I went over in my video about this that tell you exactly who Babylon the harlot was. And again, it was the city of Jerusalem. That's what this is referring to. And yes, I never actually thought about that, of this hail, this, coming down out of the sky. And it was actually the stones that were being hurled at Jerusalem. And what did they do in the Bible for adultery? They stoned them, and that is exactly what happened to Jerusalem. It was stoned by Rome with these huge boulders that were, sometimes mixed with fire. They were weighing a talent, just as it said in that verse. Then it says that Josephus said, "These engines that all the legions had ready prepared for them were admirably contrived, but still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th legion. Those that threw darts and those that threw stones were more forcible and larger than the rest, by which they not only repelled the excursions of the Jews, but drove those away that were upon the walls also. Now the stones that were cast were of the weight of a talent, and were carried 2 furlongs and farther. The blow they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was of a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness." What color is hail? Have you ever seen hail? Well, hail comes down like in huge, like white ice balls. And this is in Revelation 16. It calls it hail, and it certainly would look like giant balls of hail falling out of the sky. And it was these stones. So the next section is a tenth of the city collapses. If you're following along, it's on page 197. In Revelation 11, verse 13, "And in that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city collapsed. 7,000 were killed in the quake." So the Jewish temple was destroyed in August of 70 AD. And Josephus estimated that when that temple was destroyed, about 10,000 Jews were killed. And so Daniel Moraes, the one that I just read a quote from before, he is the author of Revelation Revolution. I don't remember if it's .com or .org, but it's a website that you can look up. And he calculates that the temple area made up approximately a tenth of the total area of Jerusalem. And that meant that its destruction was a literal tenth, meaning that with its destruction, a literal tenth of the city fell. So another prophecy that was fulfilled in the destruction of the temple this time. Now the sea of blood. Revelation 16:3, "And the second poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood, as of one dead, and every living soul that was in the sea died." Now I'm going to read an extended portion of the book here, because this is also written by the historian Josephus, which again, I want to just remind all of you who may not have seen the other ones that Josephus was a Jewish historian who was actually in Jerusalem while all of this was happening. So these are eyewitness accounts by the historian Josephus. So Josephus describes when the people of Joppa were slaughtered near the Mediterranean Sea, and this is in 67 AD. He said, "But some of them thought that to die by their own swords was lighter than by the sea, and so they killed themselves before they were drowned, although the greatest part of them were carried by the waves and dashed to pieces against the abrupt parts of the rocks, insomuch that the sea was bloody a long way, and the maritime parts were full of dead bodies. For the Romans came upon those that were carried to the shore and destroyed them, and the number of the bodies that were thus thrown out of the sea was 4,200. So later on, about 2 months later, there were Jews from Tarique, I'm not sure if I said that right, who were killed in the Sea of Galilee. And Josephus wrote, "But as many of these were repulsed when they were getting ashore, they were killed by the darts upon the lake. And the Romans leaped out of their vessels and destroyed a great many more upon the land. One might then see the lake all bloody and full of dead bodies, for not one of them escaped. And a terrible stink and a very sad sight there was on the following days over that country. For as for the shores, they were full of shipwrecks, and of dead bodies all swelled. And as the dead bodies were inflamed by the sun and putrefied," please, pardon the graphicness, but this is why people who don't understand what happened during this time period, that's why they have such a hard time thinking that it could have possibly already happened. Anyway, "They corrupted the air," meaning the putrefied bodies, "insomuch that the misery was not only the object of commiseration to the Jews, but to those that hated them and had been the authors of that misery. This was the upshot of the sea fight. The number of the slain, including those that were killed in the city before, was 6,500. So certainly seems to fulfill that prophecy too, doesn't it? And again, John Paul, he does share more details in the book, but if you want all the details, I highly recommend that you go pick the book up. I got it on, well, you can get it on Amazon. So I do have the link in the description for it. I'm not done yet, but I just wanted to add that in, because the next section that we're going to go to is given blood to drink. So in Revelation, and this is on page 199, Revelation 16, verses 4 to 6. The third poured out his bowl into the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. I heard the angel of the water saying, You are righteous, who are and who were, O Holy One, because you have judged these things. For they poured out the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve this. So it goes on to say on page 200, this is also Josephus here, and this because not only the whole country through which they fled was filled with slaughter, and Jordan could not be passed over by the reason of the dead bodies that were in it, but because the lake Asphaltitis, or the Dead Sea, was also full of dead bodies that were carried down into it by the river. So then John Paul just goes on to say that there's another really good blogger that you should look into named Adam Marshall, and he has a different point of view in the identity of the beast. But, again, this is something that I think we should all look into. And, I tend to agree a lot with what Adam Marshall says too. And he was explaining that these Jews who were pushed into the water by the Romans and drowned, it's pretty graphic, so trigger warning for any of you. I hate to say that, but you just never know. When someone drowns, they ingest a lot of water. And in this case, these Jews who were pushed into the water, they were inhaling extremely bloody water. They were drinking blood, in Adam Marshall's words. And it says here, he explains that when someone drowns, the desperate urge to breathe underwater causes them to swallow water into their lungs. In this case, as the Jews drowned, they were literally drinking blood, fulfilling the prophecy in a chillingly literal way. So, this is probably the darkest video in this series. So, I probably, should have thought to say that at the beginning of the video, but I'm sure that most of you who are watching this series, that you have either read the book or you've at least read Revelation. I hope you have at least. Don't ever just take my word for it or an author's word for it. You have to read it for yourself. And so you probably would already be aware of at least what Revelation says. But I tell people all the time, you need to look into the history of the war in Jerusalem, because you will not understand how Revelation, was fulfilled in that time period if you don't know the history of what happened. And it's not something that they ever talk about in church. They don't talk about it in school. I was never taught about the Jewish-Roman War. It's funny, all the wars that were taught about, this one was horrendous. Like, it was awful. And they don't teach it. They don't teach it in school. They don't teach it in Christian school. They don't teach it in churches. If you did go to a Christian school or some school that taught it, well, that's great. You're definitely in the minority, because most people have no idea that any of this stuff happened. So, and then John Paul just leaves a summary, and I'll just share some of his summary with you of what we just went over in this chapter. So we talked about, the sky going dark and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. It plunged Rome into darkness and brought pestilence. And that aligns with Revelation 16:10 to 11. And I just want to add again that the Jewish zealots, everything that was going on in Jerusalem during that time. And I also have to add that there was a war going on. So you could imagine that that would also darken the sky. I'm sure there were fires everywhere, smoke everywhere. So you have all of this going on, and then you have this pestilence that was happening inside the walls of Jerusalem because of the Jewish zealots breaking up into these. There were like 3 different factions of Jews, and they burned the food supply, and that brought pestilence. There were miraculous celestial events during the Jewish war that fulfilled Luke 21 to 25. He said the 4 Roman generals who killed a third of Jerusalem's Jewish inhabitants during the siege were the 4 angels from the Euphrates, mentioned in Revelation 9:14 to 15. It is amazing how all of these numbers line up exactly with what it says in Revelation. Just like in Revelation, it keeps bringing up 42 months or 1260 days. That's the time period that it says that these things are going to happen. What else was 42 months or 1260 days? The Jewish-Roman War was 3.5 years, 1260 days. I forget the other reference that I made. 42 months. Wow. Okay. Anyway, then we talked about the Romans casting these huge boulders weighing a talent that were white, that looked like huge hailstones coming out of the sky in Jerusalem. And then all this led up to the destruction of the temple and the death of thousands. And we talked about how the temple itself covered 1/10 of the city of Jerusalem, which also was in the prophecies that it would be about 1/10 of people. We talked about the war being the war making the sea, be filled with blood, and all of these bodies and the drinking of this blood. If you look at it in the perspective of people drowning in this bloody water, I mean, it's incredibly graphic. But I'm going to end with this because I think that this is what we need to hear. Christians today can find solace in the fact that this prophesied judgment is now in the past. So I'm going to go back to what I talked about in the beginning, with all this talk of now this digital ID in the UK. Just don't let fear take over, okay? Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Revelation was written to John's contemporaries. This was a warning to them. This is like us picking up a historical document, like us picking up the writings of Josephus and him writing all of this and us thinking that this is all happening to us right now. Okay? You've got to understand audience relevance, and, all prophecies have been fulfilled. And we are living in God's promises right now. We don't need to live in fear. It doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen. Yes, bad things will still happen, okay? But we can rest in God because He remains in control through all things. Jesus is on the throne right now, and we need to find our rest in that. I know that I already said that, but I can't emphasize that enough. We're not to live in fear, and we need to stop letting people manipulate us into thinking that things that already happened 2,000 years ago are happening again. Anyway, the next chapter is chapter 21, and it's about Gog and Magog. This is probably going to be a good one too. Well, not probably, it will be a good one. I'm sure that it will drum up some interest because there are a lot of people who are waiting for the war of Gog and Magog to happen right now. And so what we're going to talk about is, well, if all these things already happened, did Gog and Magog already happen too? I think you know what I think about that, but we'll talk about this some more probably next week. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to become a channel member, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. Or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.